Hey there, this is Sahila. This is my fourth attempt to produce a video to upload to YouTube, which would be the third video that is dedicated to the topic of the Global Women's Party. The cat has been really instrumental in messing up my previous attempts, walking over the keyboard and hitting the stop recording button. I don't know how we managed to do that, but that's what happens. And in the process I have 3 half-finished videos, none of which, and they're all the beginning half of the videos, and none of which I can stitch together to make one entire recording. So it's really irritating because I was being quite cohesive and concise in some of those video recordings, and now I have to start all over again, and there's no guarantee that I'm going to be cohesive and concise this time round. But I'm on timeline. My kid comes home in 13 minutes, so I'm going to try and get this done then. So this is the third video about the Global Women's Party and how we're going to get this off the ground and make an impact in the world and stop the erasure of women's sex as a sex class, and stop the erasure of women's sex-based rights, and get women half of the power on this planet in terms of our society. We're half of the species. We ought to have, in a democracy, we ought to have half of the power and half of the representation, and we do not have that. So it's time for that to change. Women have been working on getting that changed for a long, long time, and so far we have not succeeded, and it's time for that to change. I'm going to reverse order of some of the things I talked about. In terms of that, it's time to change business. Women have shown that when we get together, we can get things that we need to have happen. If we get together in the millions in individual countries or globally, we can actually make an impact. In the past, though, that's been a single issue thing. We've done that on particular issues that were up at a time in any given place, and then when the men caved and gave us what we were demanding, we moved on and got on with our lives and stopped putting the pressure on. And what we need to do is to be in a place where we can put pressure on 24/7, 365 days a year for however long it takes to get all of our demands met. We have cried, we have pleaded, we have protested, we have rallied, we have begged, we have tried to use logic, we have tried to appeal to men's empathy and compassion. Some of us have died in these attempts to get women's rights, and yet the men do not give anything easily. They will not give anything willingly. We have to fight and take it. And I think that we can do that. I don't like it that we have to do that. I had hoped that men would have evolved enough to be able to let go of patriarchy and do the right thing by their wives, their mothers, their daughters, their grandmothers, their aunts, their female cousins, their granddaughters, their sisters, their nieces, because all of this affects every single woman in a man's life. One would hope that men would care enough about the women in their lives to actually get out of the way, and if not physically and practically and materially help us, at least stop standing in the way. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Men, I often ask, where are all the good men? Because if the world was full of good men, as the men claim it is, and if the bad men were just a handful of people, were outliers, were a few males with a pathology, then why can't all the good men tell the few bad men to, STFU? Why can't they tell them to pull their heads in, and why can't they put pressure on them to behave and to get out of the way and to let women have our fair share of equality and equity? But apparently there are not that many good men in the world, because that's not a happening thing. Men must like patriarchy more than they love their wives, than the women in their lives, their wives, their mothers, their grandmothers, their daughters, their sisters, their aunts, their nieces, their female cousins, their granddaughters. Men must love the patriarchy and other men more than they love women, because I don't see that many of them getting on board this particular ship and helping to make this happen. So that's why we need to do it, and why we have to keep doing it until we get what we want. And that's really sad, and it's a heavy load considering we have our own survival to take care of as well. But if we want anything to change, it seems like we're the ones that are going to have to do the work. Where have we heard that story before? So I'm going to talk about the Seattle Shadow School Board, which is what I promised I would talk about again. This is one of my examples of many about to show you that we can do this in a different way. We don't have to do this in the hierarchical, phallic kind of way, top down, a vertical pyramid style way of doing things that men traditionally do things in. We can do things in a circular, collaborative, organic way. And that those ways work. We don't have to use the old tools to get what we want. We can break the system down using our own unique female ways of doing things. We do not have to become pretend males and use male ways of domination and hierarchy and status and power, and a few males making decisions for all males and all females to get what we want and need. And the Seattle Shadow School Board is an example of this. And what was happening in neoliberal education reform has striking similarities as to what's happening with gender ideology. And I have to bring gender ideology into this because the two pathways, the pathways for women to get equality and equity based on being half of the species in our social system, that pathway has basically run into the pathway of the gender cultists, where males are claiming that males too can be women. And that claim erases women as a sex class for legislative and policy purposes, and it erases women's rights. When you open the definition or broaden the definition of something like woman from adult female human to include the opposite, now we're supposed to be including adult male humans as women, then you make that first word that you had defined, that first concept that you had defined, you make that meaningless. Woman no longer means anything because you have included its opposite in the definition, so you've made it meaningless. You've basically erased women as a sex class. So nobody asked for that to happen, or women didn't ask for that to happen. I don't know whether the men who are pushing the gender cult, the males wearing woman face, the multimillionaires and the billionaires who are funding this agenda and who are behind its implementation through a broad range and network of astroturf groups, I don't know whether or not they had that in mind in the beginning, or whether or not that's just a beneficial side effect that they're going to take advantage of, but that's what the outcome is. So the two things have run together. So I got involved in the pushback against neoliberal education reform here in the United States around 2008 when my youngest kid started school, and I saw what was happening under neoliberal education reform, and I said, that's not for my kid. It's really bad. It's child abuse, and it's also abusive of teachers, and it sucks $600 billion of K-12 public funding. That's what the K-12 public education budget is worth annually, or it was then. $600 billion worth of taxpayer money is going into the back pockets of the corporations. And the corporations are linked to multi-billionaires who are pushing this agenda, and the billionaires at the time, I'll just name 3 or 4 of them: Eli Broad, Bill Gates, Mike Milken, a convicted fraudster, and several others. So, and they were all working together in different initiatives. So that's what's happening with the transgender push. There's a bunch of billionaires pushing transgender ideology into legislation, embedding it in law, embedding it in society, using a broad range of what are called astroturf groups. Now, They claimed that it was a grassroots movement to standardise public education, to bring in Common Core and to bring in worksheets and a whole lot of standardised testing, but it wasn't. These groups were funded by the billionaires. They were sometimes overtly linked to each other. More often than not, they had links to each other behind the scenes. They had revolving doors of people walking from one group to another and working amongst those groups. They were changing the law using what the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Corporation, I think it's called, or Commission, which was funded mostly by the Koch brothers. They were using template legislation and getting that passed at state and national federal level to change education law, and without any democracy, without putting it to the vote, without discussing it with parents, without discussing it with teachers, without putting it to a vote in a community. These changes were being made in the law behind closed doors, which is what's happening with gender ideology as well. So the similarities are remarkable. These AstroTurf groups, we had several of them here in Seattle. We had about 6 of them. I can't remember the names of all of them. But we parents used to laugh about the acronym societies. There was the Alliance for Education, A4E. There was the League of Education Voters, LEV, created and led by Nick Hanauer, who claims to be a progressive, but he doesn't walk his talk very well. There was TFA, Teach for America, which we used to call Teach for a While, because it was a Harvard graduate with a whole heap of money behind her, hiring recent graduates from colleges who would go out and do 2 years basically of missionary work amongst the poor and the downtrodden kids in public education, would pad their resumes and then come back to be highly paid staff members in corporations. There was SFC, Stand for Children, which we used to call Stand on Children. So a bunch of us parents here in Seattle worked together. We were researching what was going on. We were meeting once every month. We called ourselves Ladies Who Lunch, which was a bit of a play on the insults that were being hurled at us, that we were just another bunch of middle-class white women who were Karens. And I mean, that whole thing is, you know, when anybody is annoyed that a bunch of people say no to an agenda, then the people who say no get called Karens. It's an old insult. Funnily enough, the people in our group, mostly women, were women from every colour, skin colour, and every socioeconomic group. We were white, we were black, we were Latino or Latina, we were Chinese, we were Pacific Islander. We came from every demographic that there is represented in the Seattle Public School District. And we would meet once a month and talk about what we had been researching, and we would compare notes and share information, and we would draw diagrams, maps of who was doing, I used to joke, who's up who and who hasn't paid, who was doing what in the district and who were they really working for, who were they associated with. And we would show the connections between the different AstroTurf groups and the billionaires and the millionaires that were funding them. So one day on a Sunday afternoon, we were meeting to talk about the math curriculum being changed under neoliberal education reform, and also about what was happening with children with disabilities. And we were being sarcastic and snide about the AstroTurf groups and the acronym societies. And one of us, it might have been me, or it might have been me in collaboration with somebody else, said that we were doing the work of the school board and we should call us in all this research and keeping track of what the school board was looking at and deciding and holding their feet to the fire, and that we should call ourselves the Seattle Shadow School Board, and it would be S3B. S for Seattle, S for Shadow, S for School, B for Board, so it's S3B. And we were laughing and laughing. We were literally pissing ourselves laughing. We thought we were so clever and funny. But then we decided that we would go for it. Why not? We had nothing to lose, and we had just as much right to call ourselves an acronym society as the other grassroots or fake grassroots. We were the actual grassroots organization, and the others were fake groups. And so I got a background in journalism and research and marketing and PR, and I said all we needed to do to establish a presence in this whole fight was to start sending out some media alerts, and that's what we did. We sent out some media alerts announcing our establishment, and then we sent out some media alerts with our views on different things happening in the district, and then we started organising events that cost nothing to organise and make happen, or cost a very small amount of money, and we all put our, those of us who had resources, money to spend, would fund it, and those of us who didn't have the money to spend would do some more of the legwork. So within about 3 weeks, we were the go-to place for the media to come and ask us what we thought about what was going on in the district. We got television, newspaper and radio coverage on any and every issue that passed the desk of the Seattle school superintendent. We created a vote of no confidence in the superintendent. We found the email addresses of every single teacher in the Seattle school district, and we sent them a personalized email. We did the same thing with all the PTA councils, and we suggested that they join us in this vote of no confidence, and we told them that we had their back. We would support them if they faced repercussions from taking a stance, a vote of no confidence in the superintendent. And several schools, I can't remember how many in the end, but somewhere between 6 and 10 schools did vote as a school body and as a teaching body no confidence in the superintendent. We eventually got rid of her. She was a Broad superintendent. She had been trained by the Broad Academy, the Broad Foundation. We also eventually got rid of Teach for America, and we got rid of most, but not all, of the other neoliberal education reforms in the city. So this was really easy. We organised rallies and other events. As I said, I would get phone calls every time there was an issue happening in the school district, and a reporter would ask us or ask me, where does the Seattle Shadow School Board stand on this issue? And I would just say, what we thought about something. And we had a really big impact. This was just a group of parents who were concerned, who had as much expertise as the fake groups did, and we had skin in the game, which the fake groups didn't usually. And we got to call it out for what it was, and we managed to discredit it, and we managed to send most of it packing. Now, there are other groups that are working the same way. Hands Across the Aisle is working this way, online and offline. The women who have put together the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights are working this way. The new LGB Alliance, which has gone international, started in the UK, has gone international, it's working this way as well. So there is no reason why we can't start this way. We can start doing this, and then over time we can create a manifesto that speaks to what our platform is, and we can build that up as we go along. We keep it simple, we keep it straightforward, we keep it in basic language, and we make it inclusive of all women, not just women who self-identify as feminists. We run into problems. We need this to be a global movement of millions of women. Very few women, generally speaking, apart from in the West, call themselves feminists. They have other words for what they're doing. They might not want to be known as feminists, and even amongst the women that call themselves feminists, we have internal differences and conflicts that make it very hard to work together. So I don't want to put the word feminist in there if it's going to cause more, if it's going to create more of an obstacle than it is going to create a benefit or a solution. You can be a feminist without actually calling yourself a feminist. And ideological purity is not going to help us gather the support of millions and millions of women working together across the globe. Enough women working in each country to stand up against the gender ideology and to start demanding that women have equity and equality at the political governance level, at all governance levels. So that's about where that's at. The other thing I wanted to say is that this organisation needs to be one of collaboration and women stepping up to do what they can when they can, and to be a circular, organic group where people do what they can for however long they can, and when they need a rest or a break they take a step back, and that there are always women willing and able to step forward and fill those gaps. I have a really personal interest in talking about that because I'm doing stage 4 cancer and I'm back in chemo and radiation. And the chemo runs on a 3-week cycle. Day 1, I feel like I have chemo. Day 1 and 2, I'm functioning reasonably okay because I've been given drugs that make you a little bit hyper, steroids for example, drugs that try to minimize the risk of allergic reactions to chemo. Day 2 and day 3 and day 4 and day 5 and day 6 and day 7 I'm feeling crappy with chemo side effects. Day 7 to 10ish I'm starting to feel a bit okay, back to my normal self maybe. Day 10 through to day 21, I'm trying to pick up the balls that I've dropped in days 1 through to 10 and catch up on what I've let go of and needs attention and try to move things forward a little bit. And then on day 21/1, I get back on the chemo wheel and it starts all over again. So if people are looking for me to lead this, are looking at me for leadership, to be a constant presence and a consistent presence with the same level of energy and focus and ability to give the same amounts of time on a extended level for the duration, I can't fulfill that on my own. I'm going to be living the chemo schedule. That's not my life, but it's part of my life and it shapes my life right now. I refuse to be defined by the cancer and by the chemo, but I can't ignore it and put it on a shelf for the duration that it's going to take to get this global women's party up and running and visible and doing things out in the world. So that's why I'm looking for this organisation to be a collaborative collective of women working like a cooperative, working in a circular organic fashion, the way that our bodies produce our children, for example, the way that our bodies gestate and birth children. That doesn't happen in a hierarchical fashion. That happens in an interconnected, circular, organic fashion. So what our bodies do with our children in creating new life, I think that we women can do all together in creating a new paradigm on this planet, starting with equity and equality and governance. And unfortunately, we have to confront head-on the gender ideological cult in the process, because it's now getting in the way of us getting half, our fair share of power and position in society, because it's just erasing what it is to be a woman, what it is to be female. It's erasing us out of existence, and with it, it's erasing our sex-based rights. So what I'm going to be doing next is organising a Zoom call. I have a Zoom account. I can take up to 100 people in a call. It doesn't have a time limit. I'm hoping to set that up I was thinking about this coming Sunday, which is the day after tomorrow, in the Pacific Northwest of the US, but I think that's too soon. Doesn't give me enough time to get the word out for people, so I think I'll be aiming for next weekend. And we will find out who's in and who's willing to do stuff and what our first activities might look like. We have a Twitter account at the moment. It's not a global account yet. It's got the AU for Australia as a suffix, because one of the admins for the Global Women's Party and the 51% of the Power Facebook group set the account up, and she happens to be in Australia. So I have a Facebook public facing page for the Global Women's Party sitting on the side ready to launch, or it needs some graphics and some words inserted, and then it is ready to launch. And there are two private groups, the 51% Power group and the Global Women's Party group, that are being set up on Facebook for working behind the scenes as working pages. So that's where that's at, and I'm excited about this. I feel like the time is now. It really is now. I hear calls for this all the time. I see other women starting to work on initiatives that this group could be doing on a global level. I see eventually there's going to have to be a legal challenge where we get the courts to have to remind the rest of the world that woman means adult human female. We are going to have to get sex nutted down and defined in plain English language in the courts, to be a legal definition that cannot be messed around with the way it has been messed around now. We're going to have to get the ERA effort back up and running. We're going to have to get the Equality Act in the US scrapped, not tweaked, but scrapped. Any language in any document, any legal document that has the words gender in it, needs to be scrapped and rewritten. Gender, which is just basically personality, and sex role stereotypes, is not a thing that is not a thing that can be measured or can be reproduced or can be validated in any way, and it ought not to be part of any legislation that tells people what they can and can't do in the world. It's not a valid form of categorization of human beings. So that's about where it's at, and I'm going to say thanks for listening for 27 minutes, and I'm going to eventually upload this to YouTube today, and I'm going to stop now before something happens and ruins his fourth attempt. Alright, so this is Sahila Changebringer, and it is today, it's Fridays with Sahila. I didn't even give you an introduction. You had to wait to the end of it to get to that. And thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Message me on Facebook. I will put a link in the comments section. So message me on Facebook if you want to talk to me directly about this, and if you want invitations to the Global Women's Party Facebook group and working group, and to the 51% of the Power working group, and I will make sure that you get included. All right, take care. Namaste.